Hello guys, and welcome to the HJW Gaming channel. In this video I'm going to be taking a look at the good side elite skills from Season 5 Tactics Evolved in Lord of the Rings Rise to War. In this I'm going to discuss how useful I think each of these elite skills is, and maybe some of the builds that they'll be most appropriate to be used with. I really hope you enjoy. So, every unit has a choice between 3 different elite skills, 1 housed in the Elite 1 training and 2 in the Elite 2 training. They also have 3 passive buffs which are applicable to all units of their race. So for example, all elves will always have the same 3 options: Elven HP, Elven Resistance and Disciplined. I'm going to start by discussing the various different elite trainings that you can give the units, and then I'll circle back and deal with the passive buffs for each race towards the end. I'll leave some timestamps in the description if you want to pick up with those various different areas. So, first up unit-wise, we have the Sentinel. The Sentinel's first elite skill is called Light Armour, and this gives you up to a 15% damage reduction from enemy melee units, specifically only the melee units. Personally, I wouldn't recommend this skill for any just normal builds, because normally you'll have your ranged units protected by a melee unit in front, and they should therefore be taking the melee damage, so therefore it's unlikely that the light armour skill will be needed or come into effect. However, light armour is useful if you're running some builds that use triple ranged units. So for example, this season I've used it on Elrond, running a triple ranged unit using Sentinel and March Wardens and Bow Knights. So in which case having light armour helped to reduce that damage my units were taking. However, this is a very niche skill, so personally I don't think it's the best skill to use on the Sentinel. The first Elite 2 skill on the Sentinel is called Dispersion, and this grants you up to an additional 15% damage against all enemy units every round. So this means if your opponent is using a 3 unit composition, which is still very common in the current meta, you'll deal up to 45% bonus damage. In my opinion, for general use, this is the best skill for the Sentinel. The reason being that when you come up against enemy troops, just being able to increase your damage by a flat 45% is huge and can make the Sentinels really a strong force for dealing damage. I've often seen my Sentinels dealing more damage than the March Wardens due to this skill. And last up on the elite skills for the Sentinel, we do have the very controversial Rise Up. Now Rise Up used to be an extremely broken skill, as it would be applicable even after the units in your army had died. So what this gives you is up to a 50% damage boost to the rest of your army and your commander when your army is consisted of 3 different races. So people would run 1 stack of Rise Up Sentinels, 1 stack of another Rise Up unit of a different race, and then would run a pure set of tank units with a commander damage build such as Dwalin, and it would massively boost up that commander damage by 30% and make them almost broken. However, that has since been nerfed, and now this is only applicable whilst the units are still alive on the battlefield. You can get some strong builds going on still with this. For example, there is a strong Gandalf the Grey build which utilises Rise Up on the Sentinels, Sharpshooters, and then also uses Guardians as the frontline tank. However, again, these are quite niche builds, so as a general rule for the Sentinel, I would recommend using Dispersion, as I said earlier, for that flat damage buff. Now the second unit we're going to take a look at is the Herald, so the Elven melee unit. So the first elite skill they have is also Light Armour, so the same skill as the Sentinel. However, on the Herald, it's definitely much stronger of a skill. As the Herald is a melee unit, they'll be the one taking the damage from opposing melee units. So therefore, Light Armour can be a very, very strong elite skill for these to get that flat 15% damage reduction for your frontline unit. I definitely think this is one of, if not the best skills for the Herald. The second elite skill is Endurance. So what Endurance grants you is up to 25% damage reduction when being stunned or subject to madness or having a healing block. So it means that when you get hit by any of these, you just take a flat, reduced amount of damage. In my opinion, I don't think this is the strongest skill for the Herald. If you're finding you're being hit by stuns and madness regularly and having trouble with these, I'd recommend instead taking a look at your equipment and building against these two rather than using this skill, as 25% isn't an enormous damage reduction, and obviously it's not applicable in other situations where you're coming up against commanders that don't inflict stuns or madness, so you get almost no buff in that situation. I definitely think light armour is a much better skill compared to this, as it will be useful in almost every fight. And last up for the Herald is Lethal Strike. So this is worded as normal attacks cause the target to receive an additional up to 30% damage when being healed and lasts 1 round. So I believe this is, it inflicts a debuff upon the opposing unit. So when the opposing unit is healed, they then take an additional amount of damage. So this is very useful if you're coming up against a lot of good side commanders such as Gandalf the Grey, or potentially also a Retaliate Balin build, which use a lot of healing. However, it's very situational, as if the opposing commander isn't running a healing focused build, that additional damage isn't going to proc very often, so it won't be very useful to you. Again, I still think light armour is the best in the majority of situations. Next up we have the Bow Knight. The Bow Knight again features a couple of very familiar skills, starting with light armour. I'm not going to discuss this again, however my opinion with this mirrors that with the Sentinel. Next up, the Bow Knight can also gain Dispersion, which again I believe is the best skill for the Bow Knight, as it can help them inflict a massive amount of damage. Bow Knights in particular, when combined with a Theoden build with increased attack and then also using Dispersion, can inflict an enormous amount of damage. Last up for the Bow Knight we have Sink or Swim. Now Sink or Swim just gives your unit a flat increase in damage of up to 30%. However, it does mean that your unit can no longer take any kind of healing buff. However, when you consider that the meta builds tend to include 3 units, Dispersion every round is dealing a bonus 45% damage. So why would you limit yourself to plus 30% damage and no healing when you can have a bonus 45% damage? So this skill is far inferior to Dispersion, and so that'd be what I'd recommend for Bow Knights in almost every single build. Next up, as I'm playing Lothlorien, I do have access to the March Warden, so I'm going to run through their skills. Apologies that I can't run through the other tier 4 units. I'm sure there's other resources around that you can take a quick look at. So the March Warden again begins with light armour. My opinion again mirrors that of the Sentinel and the Bow Knight on this unit, as they are a ranged unit. Next up we have Charged Attack, which in my opinion is the best skill for the March Warden. What this gives you is up to 35% bonus damage, but this effect diminishes by 1/8 each time damage is dealt. So after 8 attacks from the March Warden, you go back to its just regular damage dealing capabilities. However, what this does mean is that your damage at the beginning in the early rounds is much higher, so 35% higher particularly to begin with. So this is very useful, as those first few rounds of combat are the most important rounds that you want to kill off as many enemies as possible to reduce the amount of damage you're getting back your way. When you consider that this is in combination with the March Warden's natural ability to use Pursuit as well, you can almost guarantee that you're going to be hitting this damage unless you're hit by a stun or madness. In my opinion, this is a great skill, not quite as good as Dispersion, but very strong and useful for increasing the damage on the March Warden. And the last skill on the March Warden is Post-Strike Response. What this means is your fastest unit has a next damage dealt increased by 1% upon receiving damage each time, and this can be stacked up to 5% bonus damage. Now the March Warden itself is a very fast unit, so it would be quite common that this could be your fastest unit, and therefore the damage buff will apply to those. In my opinion, I don't really see a great use for this skill unless in very niche builds where you have a couple of units all using post-strike response deliberately to feed damage into something like the March Warden. However, I think this isn't as strong as just getting a flat early damage buff from charged attack, so I think that's the one that I would recommend. So now we're going to move away from the elf-based units and start looking at the mannish units, and this begins with the Cavalier. Now the Cavalier's first elite skill is called Travelling Light, and this gives you a damage received buff of -15% and also gives you up to an 100% chance to evade the first 2 attacks. This is one of a number of very strong skills actually on the Cavalier, in that minus 15% damage from ranged units is very useful, particularly if you're facing off against good side, where ranged units tend to be the main damage output. As well as, in Tactics Evolved, obviously a lot of ranged units run dispersion, so reducing this damage can be a huge boon. Also, if you're facing evil and you're facing off against a lot of Sunins, this can be, again, very beneficial for countering against her. The evade isn't as big of a deal as it seems, as those first two attacks will come quite early on, particularly again if the opponent's running dispersion, so it won't dodge you an enormous amount of damage. Also, Pursuit is very, very strong in the current meta, so it's likely that that evade will be completely useless. So look at it basically as a flat 15% damage reduction from ranged units, which again is still pretty good. The second elite skill for the Cavalier is Rupture. Now, Rupture is a fantastic skill for increasing the damage dealt by your Cavalier itself. It allows your normal attacks to inflict the target with a bleed and receive 10% additional damage. On top of that, there's up to a 50% chance for the target to receive an additional 40% damage. So this can massively increase the damage output on the Cavalier. If you're using the Cavalier, say, on an army with Eowyn, focusing on melee troops and their damage, or melee Cavaliers and their damage, then this is definitely the choice for you. In my opinion, if you're using the Cavalier as a damage dealing unit, I think that using Rupture is stronger than Travelling Light, as the additional damage will outlay the damage received buff. Last up on the elite skills for the Cavalier is, similar to the Sentinels, Rise Up. Now, Rise Up, again, as I've said, has been nerfed, but there are some very strong builds with it, particularly using the Cavalier. So if you run around 1,000 of these Cavaliers with Rise Up, granting the 15% damage buff to the rest of the army and the commander, if you run this then with, say, around 1,000 Ram Riders as well, and then stack the rest of your army with 2,000 Bow Knights, and use this with a Theoden designed around increasing your army's attack, if the Bow Knight also has Dispersion, this Triumvirate here can cause an enormous amount of damage. Think of the plus 45% damage from Dispersion on the Bow Knights, also boosted by 15% due to Rise Up, along with just their regular base damage as well. It ends up making Theoden one of the most devastating commanders in Tactics Evolved, provided you have the resource production and also the conscription time queues available to build these very expensive and time-consuming units. So yeah, as a general rule, with the Cavalier, if facing off against good, Travelling Light can be strong. Rupture, I think, is the best skill for the Cavalier, but you can also run Rise Up in very specific builds. I'd recommend having a play around with these and seeing what you think is best, as all three skills are very, very strong. Next up for the Manished units, we have the Sharpshooter. Now, all three of these skills actually have been covered previously. Under Elite 1, we have Light Armour. Elite 2, we have Dispersion. And Elite 3, we have Lethal Strike. So I'm not going to run through again what all of these do and recommended builds, but I think, in my opinion, Dispersion again is the best skill for the Sharpshooter, again for that flat 45% damage buff. Next up from the Banished units are the Dunedain. Now the first skill for the Dunedain is the same as the Cavalier, it is Travelling Light, which reduces that damage received from ranged units by 15%. Now whilst I said it was strong on the Cavalier, I think it's probably even stronger on the Dunedain. The reason for this being that if you're using Dunedain in your army, you're probably speccing out deliberately to target enemy ranged units, as that's what the Dunedain are for. So using Travelling Light can again just increase that spec against enemy ranged units and really help your army counter as well as possible. Next up for the Dunedain, we have Parry, which is a new skill we're yet to see. This can give you up to a 30% chance to gain damage received minus 30%, and if that happens, your next damage dealt also increases by 30%. Now this can also be a very, very strong choice, particularly even if you've spec'd your army to counter against ranged units, you're often finding that you're hitting armies that don't use ranged units. This can help make the Dunedain a little bit stronger, as that damage received buff can make them a little bit less squishy and counter their pretty poor defences, and also increase their damage, obviously particularly against ranged units anyway, but also against any other unit. So this can be a strong general skill if you're using Dunedains in a universal army. This is particularly strong if you're using a Dunedain based build for Isildur, as Isildur massively buffs the Dunedain anyway, so this can really help push their damage onto the next level. Last up for the Dunedain, we have a fantastic skill called Steady Will. Now this grants up to 100% chance each round for your Dunedain to cure a negative status effect. Now this is brilliant, particularly if you're facing off against evil, as the evil side tends to focus a lot on causing status effects like madness and stuns, particularly if you think about like Sauron or Grima. There's a lot of madness in there, so Steady Will can really help to counter against those. Similarly, if you're using Isildur again, against evil, this can be a very, very strong choice. So again, the Dunedain Manish units have 3 very strong choices that you can go between. If facing off against good, personally I prefer Travelling Light, and if facing off against evil, I recommend Steady Will, though parry can be very strong with specific builds. So now we're going to move on to the Guard of the Tower. The Guard of the Tower's first unique skill is Divide and Conquer. This skill grants you a 6% damage received buff that stacks each round up to 5 times. So by round 5, you'll have a 30% damage debuff. This is a pretty strong choice, as of course getting that damage reduction on a unit such as the Guard of the Tower, which you're going to be using as a tank unit, can be very strong. My only slight downside to this is that of course it doesn't come into full effect until halfway through the fight in round 5, whereas ideally you'd rather it was almost the opposite way round, where you had a full amount of damage received buff at the beginning for the early rounds, and then it diminished as it went along, as those early rounds are the most important rounds. However, of course, that would probably make the skill a little bit broken. But still, this is a very good choice for most builds which use the Guard of the Tower as a tank unit. The second elite skill is Shield Training. Now this is a little bit of a niche skill, which grants the Guard of the Tower itself a damage received debuff, so your unit will receive up to 20% additional damage. However, the rest of your units will receive a 20% damage buff, so they'll take 20% less damage. So if you're running a 3-army composition, or 3-unit composition, sorry, one of your units, therefore, the Guard of the Tower, will be receiving 20% more damage, and the other 2, 20% less. So it equals out to a 20% damage reduction for your overall army. There used to be a slightly broken build using this shield training on Guards of the Tower, where the damage buff to your units would persist even after the Guards of the Tower had all died. So you'd run one command of Guards of the Tower in order to give the damage received buff to the rest of your units for the duration of the fight. However, that has now been patched, and so this is only applicable during the time the Guards of the Tower are alive. Once they've all died, this buff is null and void. This skill is only really useful if you're looking to add survivability particularly to your other couple of units, as of course it almost renders the Guard of the Tower's main selling point, the fact that it's such a tough unit and therefore can be used as a tank, it almost renders this null, as you're taking additional damage, so its tankiness is taking a hit. In my opinion, this isn't as strong of a skill as Divide and Conquer, as Divide and Conquer is better at doubling down on what the Guard of the Tower is best at. The last elite skill is probably the worst in the Guard of the Tower skill tree, and that is Survival Crisis. So this hits the enemies with a damage dealt debuff of 30% for a whole round after the Guards of the Towers have all died. The only way I can really see this useful is if you're used to using a 2-unit composition in your army, and you therefore just decide to run one command of the Guards of the Tower, so that when they die in the first round, you can reduce that damage in the early rounds from the opposition. However, I don't think it's worth using up an entire unit's elite skill training just for this purpose. So therefore, I definitely recommend Divide and Conquer for the Guards of the Tower. Last up for the Manish units, we have the Cataphract. The Cataphract's first elite skill is called Blessed Armour, and this grants a damage received buff of 25% for the first 3 rounds. Now, as the Cataphract is primarily used as a tank unit, this skill is almost perfect for them. Having a massive damage received buff during the first 3 rounds, as I said with Guard of the Tower, that's huge because those are the most important rounds, so this is almost always the best skill for the Cataphract and definitely the one I would recommend in most builds. The second elite skill that the Cataphract can have is called Armor Break, and this hit means that when you hit an enemy target, their defense is reduced by up to 20% for 1 round. It's a reasonable skill. If you're using, say, the Cataphracts on someone like Theoden or Eowyn, this can be useful in combination with a skill like Rupture on the Cavaliers, just to increase that damage flat out. Though, in my opinion, it's not as good as using Blessed Armour and improving the survivability of your Cataphracts, which is really what you usually have them in your army to do, is just to survive as well as possible and be that tank unit. Last up for the Cataphract, you have a very interesting skill called Remedy. Now, Remedy allows your units to receive an additional 30% healing when being healed, and also deal 20% damage against a random enemy whenever they're being healed. So if you're using this on a commander such as Theoden, which can heal every single round, also Galadriel is very strong when used with this skill, you get an additional 20% damage every single round if you can initiate that healing every round. If you combine this also with accessories that heal every round or every other round, this can then be boosted to another plus 20% damage. So whilst this is quite niche, if you're planning on using the Cataphract as a tank in an army for a very healing focused commander, I'm thinking Gandalf the Grey, Éomer or Theoden, then this skill can be fantastic for giving an enormous amount of extra damage to the Cataphract. So it depends what you want your Cataphract to do really. If you want to get, more healing and additional damage, run this skill. If you want to just improve the Cataphract's tankiness and their survivability and be able to use them more universally in all armies, then go for Blessed Armour. But both skills I can definitely recommend, and they're both very, very strong. So take your pick depending on which commander you're using them with. So now we move on to the Dwarven units, and this starts with the Ram Rider. Now the Ram Rider's first elite unit skill is Divide and Conquer, which allows the Ram Rider to get a damage received buff of 6% that can stack 5 times, exactly the same as that on the Guard of the Tower. However, unlike the Guard of the Tower, the Ram Rider isn't really designed to be used as a tank, or not as a primary tank unit anyway. It's usually used for its regular skill base where it can reduce the defense of the enemy units. However, this skill is still very strong, as of course you can get that stack of damage received buffs, which can improve the survivability of your army. If you're using this in, say, the Rise Up Theoden build that I mentioned earlier, this would be the skill that I would recommend using. If you want your Rams to stay alive longer, this is definitely the skill to use. Now into the Ram's Elite 2 skills. This begins with Counter Blow. Now what this does is against all enemy units, so if they're running a 3 unit combination, this will hit all 3. This can deal an additional 50% damage once you've taken 6 instances of damage. Whilst this skill initially looks good, you realise that after taking 6 instances of damage, it's quite likely that the majority of your Rams are dead, so the amount of damage that you're actually going to be dealing output wise is pretty low in my opinion, so for most builds I would not recommend this skill. The only successful use of this skill I've seen is in a very niche build used by one of my Fellowship members, Cull, who successfully used the Rams as his damage dealing unit by combining Theoden with a Retaliate Matuk build, along with other Dwarven boosting bits of gear, made the Rams themselves very, very tanky, and also allowed them to take enormous amounts of damage whilst also dealing it with the Retaliate from the Matuk, and the healing and damage buffs coming from Theoden and mounted combat. But other than for this very niche build, I would not recommend using this skill. I would say that Divide and Conquer is probably still a better skill for the Ram. Last up for the Ram Rider we have Protracted War. Now this allows the Ram Rider to recover 120% of HP upon taking 6 instances of damage. Again, similar to what I said with Counter Blow, I don't think this is as strong as it looks, as once you've taken 6 instances of damage, you've likely lost an enormous number of your Rams, and the amount of healing this will provide will be fairly low, as this will activate, say, every 2 rounds, and there's a limit to the amount of healing you can give depending on which round the healing activates in and which round you had your losses. In my opinion, this heal is just not strong enough, particularly when you can just use Divide and Conquer to reduce the number of deaths and damage you get to begin with, rather than having to heal them back to life. So I'd definitely recommend Divide and Conquer for most builds using the Ram Rider. The second Dwarven unit we're going to take a look at is the Guardian. The Guardian's first elite skill starts with Solid Metal, which reduces the damage received from ranged units by up to 15%. Now this skill is pretty good, particularly against good side, as I've said previously, that usually use ranged units as their primary damage dealer, and will also help to curb the amount of damage being received from dispersion units. However, whilst this is a good skill, in my opinion it's outweighed by the strength of the first Elite 2 skill on the Guardian. The first Elite 2 skill on the Guardian is Heavy Shield. Now, Heavy Shield reduces the damage dealt by the Guardian by 20%, however also reduces damage received by 20%, and that's not just limited to ranged units either, so it's an additional 5% buff to your damage received, and it applies to the melee units as well, and the only cost is that damage dealt debuff. Now with a Guardian, you're not going to be using this as your damage dealing unit. A Guardian is designed to be a very strong tank unit and just to soak up damage. So that damage dealt debuff is almost irrelevant, so what you can just look at is a 20% flat buff to damage received. So this is easily the best skill for the Guardian in my opinion. And last up for the Guardian is Shield Training, which is a skill it shares with the Guard of the Tower. So if you want to take my opinion for that, just quickly scroll back to the Guard of the Tower, as both the Guardian and the Guard of the Tower are both tank units, so the opinion will be the same for both of those. And last up for the standard good side units, we have the Master Thrower. The Master Thrower's first elite skill is Blessed Armour, which it shares with the Cataphract. However, my opinion in this case is nowhere near as strong. Whilst the Cataphract was designed to be a tank unit, so having a 25% damage received buff for the first 3 rounds was huge, it's not quite as important on an Axe Thrower, which is designed as a ranged unit to be more of a damage per second unit. So you don't really want your damage dealer bulking up its tankiness, you'd rather bulk up its attack or damage dealt. So whilst great on the Cataphract, I wouldn't recommend it on the Master Thrower. The second elite skill, and the first of the Elite 2 skills for the Master Thrower, is Piercing Attack. Now the Piercing Attack allows you to deal an additional 45% damage to a random ranged enemy when attacking melee units. Now this again is a very odd skill, as if the opponent's not using a melee unit in their build, which I admit is very uncommon, of course this won't trigger, and similarly if the opponent is using an all melee build, so with no ranged units, which is quite common when facing off against evil side. If you think about, say, Gothmog, which often doesn't use any ranged units, again, this will not trigger, so you won't get that damaged buff. However, when facing against good side, you'll tend to see a standard 3-unit composition, which will use 1 or 2 ranged units behind 1 or 2 melee tanks. So facing off against good side, Pierced Attack is definitely the best choice, as you'll often get that 45% damage proc. However, it is only when your Axe Thrower also hits the melee unit. So if you're not targeting the melee unit, which of course you have no control over, then this again doesn't proc. It's just one of a number of very weak skills, in my opinion, for the Master Thrower. But it's probably the best of a bad bunch when you're facing off against good side. And last up, the Master Thrower also shares a skill with the March Warden, which is Post-Strike Response. Similar to the March Warden, I don't think this is a particularly strong skill, as it's only really useful in very niche builds for buffing up a specific fast unit. Though, out of all of these, if you're facing off against good side, this potentially could be the best skill, as I don't think that Piercing Attack is particularly good against evil side. So I definitely recommend, if facing evil, just using Post-Strike Response, though don't expect it to have a huge effectiveness. It's nowhere near as strong, say, as Dispersion on other ranged units. So this kind of makes the Master Thrower one of probably the weakest units in Tactics Evolved. Personally, I don't use them and wouldn't recommend using them due to the weakness of their elite skills. So now I've taken a look at all of the elite skills and given various recommendations, I'm now going to take a look at the passive race buffs that you can apply to your armies and see which of those I think is best. One thing to note when I read through these is that when the passive buff states that it's applicable to the army, I've tested this and it doesn't apply to your entire army. It's only to the composition of those exact troops. So for example, on the Sentinels there are 3 different choices. We have Elven HP, Elven Resistance and Disciplined. Elven HP grants additional 10% HP to the army. However, this is only applicable to the Sentinels themselves in your army, not to the rest of the troops, so be aware of this. So you can gain additional 10% HP on all of your Sentinels. Elven Resistance gives you a focus damage received buff of 10%. But that's really only good if you're facing off against a lot of focus damage commanders. If you're facing off against, say, a lot of Galadriels on good side or Saurons on the evil side, then this could be a useful passive buff. Otherwise, not so strong. And then finally you have Disciplined, which can reduce the conscription and cost of the Sentinels hiring. Because I definitely recommend picking up Disciplined. I think this is the best one, particularly if you're in quite a long-running or even war, where being able to conscript your units quicker and keep those barracks up and also keep your resources up will be key. So I think Disciplined for the Elven units is probably the strongest skill. The couple of exceptions to this are, on the Herald, I would definitely recommend instead using Elven HP, as if you're running a all-Elven army and the Herald is your tank unit, you're going to want it to have that additional 10% HP, so it's a little bit of a stronger, tankier unit. Additionally, if you're running your units as a triple ranged build, so you have no melee units soaking up the damage, then I'd recommend running Elven HP on your ranged units as well. Otherwise, Disciplined is always the better option. For the men units, the 3 options are Mannish Speed, which should increase your unit's speed by 10%. There is Mannish Attack, which can increase your army's attack by 10%. And finally, Disciplined again, which can reduce conscription, cost and time by 10%. Now, Mannish Speed can be quite useful, as having increased speed can allow you to move quicker and march quicker across the battlefield, which can be very useful, and 10% is not insignificant. And on top of that, 10% additional speed for these units can also help trigger Rohirrim if used on mounted units, and also used on commanders like Theoden or Eowyn. An additional Rohirrim would also therefore grant an additional damage buff. Though in my opinion the best for most of these units is Mannish Attack, as if you're using your units to be the primary damage dealer, then Mannish Attack will almost always be the better choice. Your buff from Rohirrim from the speed is not going to be as good as an additional 10% attack. So for almost all of the men units, I'm thinking Cavalier, Sharpshooter and Dunedain, I would run Mannish Attack. However, for the Guard of the Tower and also the Cataphract, which you're both using as tank units, most of the time I would not recommend using Mannish Attack and instead going for Disciplined again, because being able to keep those troop numbers up are particularly useful in war, particularly for tanks, which are going to be taking the most of your damage and therefore the most losses, so you'll need to replenish these regularly. Also particularly useful is this on the Cataphract, which are extremely expensive and take a long time to conscript, so having that 10% reduction can be really, really nice. And lastly, we have the Dwarf unit passive buffs. So this begins with Dwarf Siege, which can increase your unit's siege capability by 10%. Next up you have Dwarves Resistance, which is very similar to Elven Resistance in that it gives you a 10% buff to focus damage resistance. And lastly again, you once again have Disciplined on offer. Now, for almost all of these, again, I would recommend running Disciplined, as the focus damage resistance is very niche unless you're facing off against a lot of Saurons and Galadriels, as I previously said. So Disciplined again, just being able to get those units in as quickly as possible is probably the best buff. The one slight limiting factor to this is on the Guardian. If you're not using your Guardian as a tank unit or using it in war at all, and they're just sitting around only being used as siege units, then running Dwarf Siege could be beneficial, as Good Side has very famously awful siege units. So being able to give the Guardian an additional 10% siege can help increase your siege capabilities. But it's unlikely that you're going to have, loads of these lying around not being used in war, and also have enough gold and time to have these elite conscription queues going to get these all the way up to Elite 3. It would be a massive waste of resources in my opinion. But the option's there if you want it. Anyway, that's going to be the end of this video for the faction Good Side units. I will be doing additional videos on the Evil Side faction units, and also taking a look at both good and evil neutral units in a similar way to how I've done this one. If you have enjoyed the video, please drop a like and please consider hitting the subscribe button. And if you want to see more content from me, please click the linked video in my outro to see more of my content. And if you do so, I really hope to see you on the next one.